Hey there. If you're here for just the tabs, they're attached in the description below. But I thought it would be fun for me to try and break down what makes these riffs sound so good and how you could apply that to your own playing. Now, this is a video I've been looking forward to and dreading because the thing about Black Tongue and Nadir in particular is there's no one trick. So it's quite easy for me to take something like the intro to Car Bombs, Lights Out, and say, here's the trick, you can do it like this, right? And it might be a complicated trick, I'm not saying it's not, but there's usually only one or two ideas you need to nail to get something that sounds like that in your own playing or composition. Now, what makes Nadir so cool is that it's basically just metal done incredibly well. So there's no one trick. There's no like one little thing you can just pull out and add into your playing. But I've tried to isolate common themes or ideas that I think are reusable and will make your riff writing much stronger. So one thing I think Black Tongue are better at than almost every other band is writing riffs that end on a leading note. So let me explain what I mean from first principles. So the most common scale in the Western world is the major scale. So that sounds something like this. So if you've been raised with quote-unquote normal music, what you will find is that seventh note I played, the one that's a semitone below the octave, you really want it to come up that semitone. So a riff is a repeating pattern. If the end of the riff doesn't want to make you hear the riff again, it's not a very good riff. And Black Tongue basically, not always, but really commonly, end a section of a riff on a leading note so that you want the next section to arrive. So Second Death in particular is full of this. So let me show you. So if we listen to the kind of, I don't know what you would call this riff, but this 4-bar riff here. So these octaves here, they're playing the leading note. And you can see I've annotated the tab. So I haven't annotated like every single appearance, but everywhere I thought it was structurally relevant, like it makes a 4-bar section or 2-bar section stronger, I noted it. This whole section here is harmonic minor. So what is the harmonic minor? So I said the major scale was the most common scale, but we're into metal, so we don't like the major scale. It's too much Baba Black Sheep. So we might play the minor scale. And you might notice that the 7th note in the minor scale, it doesn't have the same pull. It doesn't have that emotional heft that makes you really want that last note, that 8th note to come along. And that's because it's a full tone below the root instead of a semitone below the root. So what you can do is you can just change that note and make it cool by raising it one semitone. So now it sounds like this. Yeah, that's cool. That's the good stuff. So basically, this whole trem pick section, which sounds awesome, is straight from the harmonic minor scale. So you could learn that scale, reorder the notes a little bit, throw in some nice trem picking, and you will write something like this, hopefully. And remember to end on the leading note, because that is, of course, the coolest note. And of course it ends on the leading note, right? Like, it's so obvious. When you hear that note, you want to hear more. That's the whole point. This riff, it alternates between what would be called a 1 chord and a 5 chord. This 5 chord contains the leading note. creates anticipation. So have a listen. And even this little trill, that 4th fret note, again, that's the leading note. Just to keep proving my point, if we listen to this when it ends with, I always think of this move as the Darth Vader move. It's a kind of black metal kind of thing, but I won't get into that in depth right now, but have a listen. Those 11th fret notes, they are the leading note. Again, new riff section ends with the leading note. Repetition is a powerful tool to get your point across. What about the main riff of the song? Oh, Guitar Pro kind of glitched out there. But this note is the leading note, once again. This is a cool thing. It's the leading note. What your heart and soul wants it to do is rise into the root note. What do? They bend it, but not quite enough to reach the root note. Black tongue, you cheeky tease. And then, of course, the final thing is basically the same thing in power chords. So I think that's a really good riff writing habit to get into. Make sure your riff ends in a way that makes the next repeat more desirable, right? It's a big ingredient, and you want to build tension, right? You want to build drama, suspense, and anticipation, and then you can release it, right? You can play that big open low C, right? And really like give people what they want. But you've got to build enough suspense for people to actually want it first. Okay, so let's discuss another one of the kind of elephants in the room when it comes to Black Tongue, and that is how ridiculously low-tuned their guitars are. So, for perspective, I played almost all of these in a 7th string, in drop A, pitch shifted down another 9 semitones. So, from high to low, the guitar sounded like this. With that note is about as low as a normal guitar's low E string. So we're kind of down in that kind of same kind of musical range as a 5-string bass. So how do you? So you could say, well, it's easy to write heavy riffs in this tuning. You just play whatever you like, and it's so low pitched, it's kind of heavy, and that's kind of true. Lower is heavier, blah blah blah. But basically, it would make them a very one-dimensional band. And if you try this, if you take any crazy low tuning and you chug away for like 5 minutes, honestly, it sounds tired, right? You will be bored of it. It's not going to sound super heavy when you hit that low string. Like, remember the first time you heard a 7-string that was just so much lower and it was so much heavier? Like, do you still feel like that every time you hear any 7-string? No, of course not. And there's a kind of arms race effect, and I mean, Black Tongue are obviously really pushing the boat, but one thing I think that's really cool is they've got a few, I guess you could call them strategies, to use their tuning rather than abuse it. And tuning this low has downsides as well for heaviness. So, for example, when you tune this low, things get really muddy and indistinct. So I spend a crazy amount of my time, and like all I do with guitars, I figure out this kind of like really heavy low tuned stuff, trying to figure out if the low notes are actually different notes. Right, so I'll be listening to like Vilcharda or Fractalize, and I'll be like, is that a really low E or a really low F? And sometimes I'll work out a riff and I think I have it right, and I'll be like way off. Like, not just like adjacent notes off, like way off. It's so low pitched, the amount of pitch information you get through the distortion and the tuning is minimal. So you can't really play chords. Everything's super muddy. And Meshuggah kind of worked this out when they started doing Nothing, which was their lowest tuned album at the time. They started moving to playing single notes for almost everything, and that was how they got around all the mud. Black Tongue have a few different strategies for this, and I think there's one really simple. So some of them are really simple. So if you're playing in this tuning or something like it, I would really advise you to pay attention to how they do things. So First of all, they are actually very rarely playing in the very lowest register of the instrument, right? So they actually could be playing stuff in, say, the first 5 frets of that lowest string, and they almost never do. They actually tend to, say, for example, play things up in the middle of the guitar and then drop down for that big low chug. Yeah, they do that. But it's very rare you have a whole riff, right? Even this riff, it's kind of mostly up at the 12th fret on that low string, and it doesn't really come down past that, right? So they're actually not using the very bottom of the instrument except for the real filthiest chugs and the bottom end of these kind of pedal tone riffs. So they're not actually using the lowest notes available to them that often. That really helps you stop getting bored of them. Then another thing you could do to make things clearer is play things in octaves. So like you could play this riff with just these notes here. By adding the doubling higher up, you give it a lot more clarity because there's one note there that's in a kind of comfortable range for us to hear. These notes are a little bit low, but it's easier to make out because we have more information. Another really clever thing is they will often actually repeat things down an octave. So like if we take the kind of very last riff in Abuse Ritual, so they play that riff first where it's quite clear, right? High pitched enough that you can make out all the notes distinctly, and then play it down really low. So that makes a lot of sense, right? If you play the riff up high first, right, people are like, okay, I know the shape of the notes, I know how it's going to sound. And then when you bring it down, it really crushes and it feels more clear because you've just heard it once already, basically. And that's something I hadn't really considered. It's also pretty shocking, right? When you hear a riff in that kind of like register, that part of the instrument, and then it drops down an octave, you're like, ooh, right? So yeah, good job, Black Tongue. And then this is the final thing, and I only kind of really noticed this today. Black Tongue plays slower when they play lower. So the kind of most consistently low-pitched riff I figured out, I think, is this one from Eternal Return to Ruin. So most of this riff is more low pitched, and then when the speed picks up, so does the actual pitch, right? When they're playing more and more distinct notes that you need to be able to perceive for the riff to land, they're actually playing at a higher pitch, so it's easier to do that. Like this riff, for example, they could play that 2 octaves lower. It might be heavier, but it would just be a mush. It would just be like alphabet soup of low notes. It wouldn't crush. So that's something I've only kind of come across. This is a way of thinking about things I haven't been exposed to before, which is simply that when you're in these low tunings, when you're playing the really low pitches, just play slower and it's easier for people to understand what you're doing. Finally, Black Tongue are kind of all-around masters of metal guitar articulation. So that means that every note is shaped in a way that makes it heavy, right? So they use a mixture of, for example, palm muting, and then open notes to get that classic Metallica-esque pop of the high notes. They're doing really cool stuff where they're, for example, picking and palm muting versus legato hammers and pull-offs to get this kind of sound in Ultima Necat. They have all this stuff, for example, in at the end of Eternal Return to Ruin, where they're just nailing the vibrato. They're using, say, open notes, let ring over low ones. Right, that kind of stuff. They can really chug, they can pick scrape, they can pick slide. They've just got it all together. And they know how thick to get the notes. So you'll see sometimes the same riff is played in single notes or octaves or power chords or 3-note power chords. And it's like they've actually taken the care to really polish these riffs, you know, like, should this riff be single notes? What if we play it the second time we play it in power chords? And they basically invest heavily. And I think this is one of the things that makes their riffs just like one level better than the competition, you know? Like, I might write this riff and not throw in the vibrato in the same place, and it's just getting it right. And this is a kind of a bit of a cop-out as a teacher, because basically what you have to do to get this is listen to a lot of metal and write a lot of metal. So I basically come around to saying Black Tongue are good at metal because they're good at metal. But it's true, but maybe not very helpful advice. Anyway, so I've hopefully given you some easy to follow advice and maybe some slightly less easy to follow advice. Hope you enjoy it, and sorry for all the mistakes in the tabs.